This session here today is to begin to think about, in a more public way, a project that some of us are hoping to conduct at the next Internet Governance Forum in Brazil this November that would use the method, the technology of deliberative polling to try and engage in a different way of doing a multi-stakeholder conversation to address the challenges of internet governance in the world we live in today, with a particular view toward affirming the net mundial principles of human rights, cultural and linguistic diversity, security and stability, and obviously an open, unfragmented cyberspace. And how do we reconcile those goals and the different interests of different stakeholders in this often very contested space? And so what I'm going to propose as a way of proceeding is that first I'd like to ask our friend and collaborator, Eileen Donahoe, who's Director of Global Affairs at Human Rights Watch, and who's a member of the coordinating committee of Net Mundial, to say a few words about what has inspired this initiative and what its logic is. Then I'd like to ask my colleague at Stanford University and Director of the Center on Deliberative Democracy, Professor James Fishkin, Professor of Communication, to talk about what a deliberative poll is, how it works. Actually, we're planning to do one here in Ulaanbaatar as well, but that's a separate issue, not really related to this conference. And then we'd like to get the views of several possible stakeholders in this to bring different perspectives to bear. One is Chris Riley, who's the head of public policy for Mozilla. And then, have we been joined yet by Simone Halink of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs? So perhaps you could speak next. And has Ritu Srivastava joined us yet? So if Ritu comes, we'll hear from her. And also Naran Jargal from the Public Oversight Council of the Independent Authority Against Corruption here in Mongolia. We may seek her views as well, but most importantly, all of your views. So we're a little late in starting because the conferences, as many conferences do, been running late. And with that, let me simply turn it over to Eileen.
Thank you, Larry. So as somebody who has been working at the intersection of internet freedom, digital rights, cybersecurity, and internet governance, as soon as I heard about this project, I was completely intrigued and really attracted to trying to get involved with it. Because on its face, the mechanism of deliberative polling struck me as something that has the potential to be a new vehicle and tool on several dimensions of internet governance, policy making, and capacity building, both with respect to substantive policy and with respect to process questions. And stepping back, I think all of us want to acknowledge this is essentially an experiment, and in the spirit of many things that happen in the internet space. But it is something that it's a mechanism that's been around for decades, that Jim has developed and applied successfully in many, many settings with respect to all different kinds of policies in many countries around the world. So this is perhaps the first time it's being applied to internet governance, but I think it has a lot of potential, and I think it's worth watching. And I hope all of you are interested after this session and go back and speak about it with your communities. So from where I sit, first of all, it has potential to make progress on highly contested substantive policy questions that are of core concern to both Freedom Online Coalition members as well as the larger internet governance community, such as how to protect human rights and the rule of law in the digital realm, how to optimize for both privacy and security in cyberspace, and how to expand access to connection technology without also undermining rights. Second, it has the potential to help in highly contested process questions, internet governance process questions, such as how to generate policy outcomes on complex, multi-layered issues across different stakeholder groups in a global context, and generate some semblance of legitimacy for those policy choices when direct input from all affected stakeholders is not, in fact, yet possible. Equally important, from my point of view, is the fact that this tool and mechanism has the potential to be replicated in other fora and other locations to provide input from new communities and different stakeholders. So in this regard, the deliberative polling is a means to build capacity for internet governance processes themselves, not just capacity, technology capacities, but capacities for processes. Since it's easily replicable, it is a good way to, and a simple means to expand the pool of participants from whom input is gathered on contested policy areas, moving new stakeholders into the process, rather than turning solely to the subgroups of people like us who can show up at FOC meetings or IGF meetings or Net Mundial meetings in Brazil. It can be replicated around the world. So accordingly, the reason that matters to me, and it should matter to those in this space, is that it has the potential to help make progress in one of the thorniest issues in internet governance, which is simply how to generate a sense of legitimacy and authority for outcomes in a context where there's no means by which to get direct input from all impacted stakeholders and where there aren't legitimate vehicles for democratic representation of all stakeholders impacted by internet infrastructure. So that's a really, really big issue. And if this is successful, it has the potential to really get at that issue in a brand new way. To make this a little bit more concrete, I just want to do a little bit of a thought exercise and imagine if this deliberative polling mechanism had been brought to the Net Mundial event in Brazil, the original, last April. As many of you, some of you were actually present, you know that the Net Mundial outcome identified both substantive governance principles as well as process issues. But in order to come to a rough consensus, many of the principles were articulated at a very high level of generality and in somewhat vague terms. And as you may know, a number of members of civil society left the meeting somewhat dissatisfied and disgruntled because they felt that there was not more clarity on how to proceed to implementation on these highly contested substantive areas like net neutrality, internet intermediary liability, or articulation of necessary restrictions on mass surveillance. And in fact, in the final statement, a subgroup from civil society actually made the complaint and said, I have a quote, "We feel that this document has not sufficiently moved us beyond the status quo in terms of protection of fundamental rights and the balance of power and influence of different stakeholder groups." So I would say for any of those discontent with this lowest common denominator kind of approach in these internet governance spaces, multi-stakeholder spaces, this mechanism has the potential to go to the next level. Deliberative polling, and Jim will describe this next, does not necessarily guarantee a consensus outcome at the end of an experiment, but it will help identify and clarify after deliberation based on high quality information with relevance to the substantive issue at stake, where there are strong differences, and alternatively where there's room for more optimal and concrete decision making about which choices to make, rather than just remaining on very vague and a high level of generality. The bottom line is that this mechanism has the potential to contribute insight with respect to core policy concerns in the Freedom Online Coalition on expanding access to communication technology, strengthening digital and cybersecurity, and enacting more inclusive, transparent, multi-stakeholder governance. And it can help us learn how to move from general principles to implementation of policy in contested areas, and most importantly, provide a new vehicle for gathering input from new players on a cross-regional, multi-layer, multi-stakeholder basis, which in and of itself is a good. And so I just encourage you all now to listen to the richer description from Jim about how this would actually work, and imagine that it could be replicated in your communities or in different venues internationally.
Great. Okay, so if you came in late, that was Eileen Donahoe of Human Rights Watch, and now I will hand the floor to my colleague at Stanford University, Director of the Center for Deliberative Democracy, Jim Fishkin.
Great. So let me describe what a deliberative poll is, how it's been used around the world, and why we think it might work in this case. The idea is embarrassingly simple. In fact, I remember an old saying, there's nothing so obvious as a good idea once you clearly express it. This will seem really obvious as I describe it. Nevertheless, it has proven very useful and has been used in many countries. In fact, in the last few weeks, my collaborators and former students did a national deliberative poll in South Korea on nuclear waste disposal. I collaborated on a national deliberative poll in Tanzania on what they should do with the natural gas windfall. We did 2 projects in Uganda, so we can do this even with less educated populations. And we've done highly difficult, contentious issues like desegregating the schools in Bulgaria with the Roma, the cooperation between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, which has led to some cooperation among the schools at least in one region, the Oma area. And indeed, right now, I'm here partly also because we're planning a project with the city of Ulaanbaatar here in Mongolia, and I was here a few months ago with the Asia Foundation. So there are lots of uses of this. So what is it? As I say, it's almost embarrassingly obvious. Nevertheless, a simple idea, implementing a simple idea is sometimes very complicated. A deliberative poll is just a random sample, it's just a survey with a random sample of a population before and after it has had a chance to really consider the issues under good conditions, to deliberate the issues, usually in face-to-face discussions in small groups with moderators and questions to competing experts in plenary sessions. That's my account of what the good conditions are. We sometimes do this online, but most of the time we do it face-to-face, and face-to-face has a lot of advantages. But the online process works well. And here we're proposing to, ironically, deliberate about internet governance face-to-face. Now, the premise of this project is that the IGF community is a relevant community, a population. If you accept that, we will randomly sample that population stratified by sector and region, so that it's overall, we'll take 300 who are overall representative of that, the IGF population, and engage them in a day and a half or a little more of additional deliberation at the beginning, before the process starts. And we will also give the same questionnaire to all the other IGF participants who are coming in. And we'll give the same questionnaire afterwards to all the other IGF. So it'll be a controlled experiment. But the key is that when people deliberate, if instead of talking to the people you always talk to, you talk to people from many different sectors and viewpoints, and you talk in carefully moderated small group discussions, you clarify questions that you will have prominent panelists, and we have very prominent people already involved in the advisory group to set up the agenda for this. So the whole thing, the questionnaire, is vetted with an advisory group. I'm sorry, I'm telling the story backwards. We've already begun with an advisory group, a very distinguished advisory group of key people involved in internet governance who are clarifying key issues and trade-offs, and who will supervise all the work to set an agenda of what are some of the really pressing issues. And we also welcome input about what all those pressing issues would be. What are the most pressing issues which in the normal process of multi-stakeholder governance would sort of get papered over with consensus statements. If instead you have a deliberative poll, you will have the views before and after deliberation about those options for action. But in addition, we'll have lots of explanatory variables about the assumptions that lead people to support or oppose a proposal and why, and as well as their values, information questions. And we will be able to quantitatively and qualitatively explain why people hold and come to the views that they do, what they can agree about and what they won't agree about. What are the sticking points? What are the ways, what are the areas in which movement would not be possible? And what are the areas where movement of opinion would be possible and why? And that provides a route to responsible advocacy for moving forward the internet governance process beyond these general statements. And so we've done this about 70 times in 23 countries around the world. Highly developed countries, developing countries, as I said. It seems to me that the problem is for internet governance is to get a handle on the multinational, international, multi-stakeholder, multi-sector process. Now, another assumption, so that basically there are two assumptions. I have no doubt from all of these problems that we've done in highly contentious issues. We've done a national project in Japan that provided the logic for how to reform the pension system, for example. We are even doing this at the local level in China, believe it or not, in a number of cases. In fact, there's another project in Shanghai in a few weeks. Nevertheless, so many challenging circumstances. But there are two premises of this project. One is that the IGF attendees are a relevant population from which to sample if you're interested in internet governance. And the second is that if people deliberate together and they offer their views in confidential questionnaires at the beginning and at the very end, they're not accountable to anybody else for what they offer. We're trying to get their sincere views as netizens. Now, with some people that may be difficult if they're government representatives. Nevertheless, we're going to have we're going to pledge a security system where we're getting what they really think confidentially so that we can know what they think about the merits of the issues. And if we can get them to behave more or less as netizens, rather than as ambassadors who are simply seeking instructions from those who sent them, as netizens, so they're really going to think about the merits of the issues, and we think that we can make a success of this, and we think that this could be easily added as a tool for not just one IGF, but many internet governance occasions. So that's the basic idea.
Okay, so that is the essence of the concept for a deliberative poll at the Internet Governance Forum, ideally in Brazil this November. Now we'd love to get thoughts on whether this makes sense and what issues it should be wrestling with and what this might or might not do to advance, you know, kind of progressive principles in internet governance. So let me turn to Simone Halink of the Dutch Foreign Ministry.
Thank you. Before giving my thoughts on it, I just wanted sort of one question of clarification. So the poll is going to give a clear idea of what the contentious issues are. But I'm wondering, because you're talking about also discussing trade-offs and challenges, whether there will be sort of with those outcomes, whether there will be sort of more information about sort of the alternatives. So if people say, I don't want an IANA transitions, what do they want? Is that part of the polling?
Oh, yeah. In other words, a range of alternatives. I'm sorry. The idea is always to probe a range of alternatives, alternative actions trying to deal with the same problem. And the briefing materials, which serve as an initial basis for discussion, will have pros and cons of the different alternative policy approaches. And advisory group will vet those materials, not to agree on what should be done, but to agree that the information is accurate and that this is a reasonable statement of the case for and against a variety of options. Then all the groups will also be taped and transcribed so that they can be edited, and lots of other suggestions will come out. There may also be some open-ended questions, but the idea of getting the views before and after is so that you can see the changes of opinion. But yeah, it's all a matter of grappling with, should we do this or should we do that? And, or should we do something else? And why? And what are good reasons? And what are the reasons that have weight with the public? And what are the reasons that don't?
All right, thanks. So, and this, my question actually goes to sort of the core, I think, of the reason why I'm enthusiastic about the idea, because I think what happens a lot in policy discussions, or in any discussions for that matter, is saying no to something, and that's very easy. It stops the thinking, and it makes a very sort of generally sort of a bad sort of situation to move forward in. So I think because of this of the fact that this project goes further than saying no and actually looking to the alternatives, I think that is actually its strength. And in terms of sort of laying out what the issues are and what the alternatives are, I'm more enthusiastic about the alternatives than about sort of laying out the most contentious issues, because I think at least sort of what I've observed, I think those are pretty much clear. Of course, there's always nuances. There's lots of more that can be said about that, but I'm particularly interested if people say no or yes to a certain situation, what are the consequences, or what do or don't they want instead? And I think that is actually where this could be breaking ground. Where I have some thoughts in terms of, well, maybe, yeah, in honesty, sort of where I'm not entirely convinced yet, is the IGF population. Although I think it's a good base, at least based on my own experience with the recent GCCS. I think the fact that people are coming to a conference doesn't mean they have knowledge, and well, and I think some of the issues before, or some of the IGF or the IG issues that are out there are super complex. So even with, you know, like a basic paper or some briefing before, I don't think that you can have sort of a very sort of balanced opinion about that. So that is something where I am not so convinced yet. I have to admit, I don't know, like, probably you would have to send people to university for 4 years before then being able to do a poll, like, and do the same study, something like that. I'm not sure what the solution would be, but I think it requires a little bit more thinking. In the paper, I saw that there was no mention of gender balance, which I actually think in cases like these is super important.
No, we would.
Yeah.
That would be.
Yeah.
If that wasn't mentioned, if that was not mentioned, that was an omission.
Okay. Yeah. Happy to hear.
Yeah, because we stratify from the population until we get, so we randomly select to fill the strata, but it becomes a random sample of the 3,000 or whatever it is who are coming, but the 300 should be representative on the factors that we're stratifying, and we would include gender in that.
Okay, great.
And
So gender balance, regional balance, professional balance.
a sector,
The whole idea
yeah.
is to have very representative and diverse
Yeah.
samples.
Yeah.
And then I think on the population issue, I think the last question I have, and it actually also comes from our recent experiences with one of the FOC working groups, is asking at least government officials, and I think it goes for many officials, to sort of not respond to polls or surveys like these, or when they are acting in their official capacity, is, I think, a very difficult thing. So if I would do this for my government, even if I was saying I'm doing this in a personal capacity, then I wouldn't be able to break away from it entirely. So I think
It's the not entirely that's really interesting.
there's always you can always balance somewhere, but you know, like, and I think people, I think that would, if you're not honest about that point, I think that that could be not problematic, but it could be at least sort of a dishonesty, I think, in the plan. And then I think my other question is about implementation. And of course, it also has to do with, in the end, reputation of the project and how people view it. But I think there is within any at this point in that related discussion, there's been a lot of talking, and the difference you can make is actually help sort of using the outcomes to actually change or influence the discussion. And so, at least from what I've heard, and I understand it's a work in progress, I'm not entirely sure what, in the end, effectiveness, except from a very sort of laudable effort, what the effectiveness or the output of in terms of what it would actually, how it would make a difference for a discussion in a broader whole would be. Yeah.
It was a two-finger on the question of... Oh, sorry. I'm Bertrand Lachapelle. I'm the director of the Internet and Jurisdiction Project. It was just a comment on the question of representation. There's a challenge because if you want it to be representative of the actual composition of the 3,000 people who come, there's a great likelihood that there is no gender balance. So is it representative of what it is? Or is it intended to be representative of what it should be? And I understand that it's not an easy question because there's a tension there. How do you handle this question?
That's a great philosophical question. I think that one thing is we're going to have to be completely transparent about what the criteria are. I think that we could justify, provided we were representative in all the other ways, saying that this is we are recruiting from the IGF the internet community that we think would be desirable for dealing ideally with these problems, and so it would be more balanced as to gender than the full IGF participation happens to be. I think so long as we are very explicit about the process and the criteria by which we do it, and we explain what we're doing, I think that might actually serve as a kind of example for internet governance discussions in the future. As for the talk, whether talk makes any difference, then you have to say, well, is the multi-stakeholder governance process of talking, does it ever make any difference? Can we improve it in some way where it might have a chance of making more of a difference if we clarified some of the issues and we showed where progress might be possible and where not, and for what reasons? So your point that it might just all be talk is well taken, but if talk has any chance and this whole process has any chance, we think we could refine and improve the process a bit this way.
Okay, I'm going to ask our other commentators just to indulge me a little bit because there's a few other people that seem to have urgent questions, so please go ahead.
Hi, I don't know how urgent this is, but my name is Lara Kasper. I work with Global Partners Digital. We actually support the Freedom Online Coalition as a secretariat. I'm also a member of the IGF MAG, so I find this a very interesting approach. I do have something that I was thinking about when Simone was speaking. It has to do, well, she mentioned implementation, but actually how I would frame it, the issue there is the link to actual policy or decision-making processes. So my question for you would be how you see that and why did you choose IGF to engage? Because I don't know how familiar people here are with how the IGF works, it doesn't have any decision-making authority. It is to a large extent still, and it's unlikely that it will change, continues to be a discussion forum. And the examples that you mentioned earlier were very much linked to policy processes, as far as I understand, like the ones you mentioned in Japan. And so that would be an interesting thing to hear your views on how you think this will relate to actual policy processes to make it relevant. And maybe just quickly also just on the point on representation. you will stratify the sample, because if it's random, then it's not going to work, because the representation of governments at the IGF is disproportionate to all other stakeholders. And I think in terms of where decision making is actually happening, you need to have a representative government sample in the poll.
Clear how big each of the strata are and for what reasons, and whether we take the distribution that there is or whether we say we want more civil society than otherwise. We're just going to have to be very transparent about that. Look, the policy options, I think Eileen should say something about this, but I just want to say the advisory group is going to be the advisory group is going to be working to identify policy areas where the results of this could have an impact, could be consequential. And we've got working groups now engaged in trying to prepare that properly. If it's prepared properly, then we'll have a good agenda, some of which will be ripe for action by somebody or other. But I should let Eileen.
So really briefly, we've just begun the process of developing the materials. And so far, we have 3 big buckets, one of which is about all the questions around access to information, access to connection technology, which, net neutrality and all those things would fall under. The second large category is cybersecurity as it relates to, international peace and security, national security, digital data protection, digital security for users, the whole bucket. And then the third large category is on the IG process questions, and what is the meaning of multi-stakeholderism? How do you do it transparent, inclusive? What's the meaning of bottoms up, equal footing? What's the meaning of all this terminology? I just want to go back to a question several of you have raised about the relevance of the IGF as a community. One of the things that I really was attracted to is the fact that it's replicable elsewhere in places where policy actually does take place, or in other regional groups and other types of fora. The IGF was just a good place to start because everybody there is interested. And it doesn't mean that they're the most knowledgeable or that they have a role in policy making, but at least it's a community that cares and will be attracted, hopefully, to participating. But it isn't necessarily the best model for where this mechanism could yield the most useful information. So the fact that we're going to learn things there and then we can take it elsewhere and shop it in different places is part of what I think is interesting.
Sure. Hi, my name's Rebecca McKinnon. I direct the Ranking Digital Rights Project, the New America Foundation, also kind of somewhat relevant for this. I'm co-founder of Global Voices, which is an international citizen media community. I guess I had one question and then maybe 3 suggestions for other places where this, because I think this mechanism is potentially quite exciting. I wonder if there might be some other vectors that might yield more kind of productive results as well. So I just thought I'd throw out a few suggestions since I'm probably gonna have to leave early anyway. One question I had is, have you thought about doing this at regional IGFs, and to what extent you're operating in a multilingual kind of approach, given that those involved with internet policy debates who are English speakers and those who are involved with internet policy debates that don't speak English, they're different. There's a lot of different conversations going on, and so, the other kind of representation issue with the main IGF is, when you get beyond governments, is who has funding to go, and also who's capable, who has experience talking at international meetings, and that skews the sample of stakeholders quite a lot. So it'll be really interesting to see if this is useful, and if you find it interesting enough that you could take it to some of the regional IGFs in Africa, for instance, and East Asia. One other sort of set of comments I had that I thought might be useful for discussion is that there's internet governance with a capital I and a capital G that involves the actual sort of quote-unquote internet governance institutions. And then there are processes of internet governance with a lowercase I and lowercase g, just in terms of decision-making that goes on all over the place that shapes how the internet works and what people can and cannot do. And I think it's in the lowercase I, lowercase g internet governance where some of this kind of deliberative mechanism might be particularly powerful. And I would point to kind of 3 areas. One is, particularly in the Global Voices community, a lot of the people don't go to internet governance meetings because they're so focused on fighting battles at home with policy that's being passed that's kind of shaping kind of entire regions in terms of how, and there's very little stakeholder engagement in terms of how laws are being passed at the national level, and also very little stakeholder engagement on the part of a lot of governments that are then going to ICANN and advocating for particular positions. There's not actually always a very good, or going to the wicket or something. There's not actually often much consultation going on between whatever part of the government is advocating for its government's internet policy interests and kind of what stakeholders at home, feel is important to them. And, that's just because the legislative process, people aren't getting elected on their positions around internet policy. So just the entire lawmaking and kind of, what the government sees, that it's represented, is too disconnected from internet issues. And this kind of deliberative polling might be a really important way to bridge that gap. So that's one vector. Another vector has to do with the fact, and this is something that Bertrand works on quite a bit, is that you have jurisdictions that are passing laws that affect internet users all over the world that are not constituents of those who pass the laws. So, or judgments being made or frameworks being built. So for instance, in the Global Voices community, there's a great deal of reaction about what's going on in the European Union with right to be forgotten, and decisions being made in the European Union that are going to affect internet users absolutely everywhere. But of course, those who are being, the leaders in Europe only care about their European constituents. And so there could be a really interesting process which is a real gap, I think, right now in internet policymaking, of bringing in sort of affected stakeholders that are outside the jurisdiction that is passing laws that have an impact globally. So that's a second vector that I think this mechanism, I haven't kind of come across another mechanism that has the potential to do something useful in that regard. A third vector has to do with companies' own private policymaking. So for instance, Facebook, in developing its terms of service, its policies around identities, what people can and cannot do on Facebook, or Google or whatever, for a while, Facebook actually had people vote on their privacy policies, and it was kind of a failed experiment for lots of reasons that nobody needs to waste time on. But it seems to me that a lot of members of civil society, some in the room and others, have been concerned or have been calling for internet companies to do a better job of engaging with their user communities about the policies they're setting and how they're enforcing those policies. And it seems to me that some form of deliberative polling could begin to get there. It would be tricky because you'd have to be very multilingual and, it would be complicated. But we need some way to kind of build representative constituencies within these kind of private domains. And this strikes me as an exciting and interesting way of beginning to get at that. So sorry for the long set of comments, but I might have to leave early, so thanks.
I feel that at least 10 people have come into the room since you described what this is. So can you take 30 to 40 seconds and really no more to give just the elevator pitch version of what the deliberative poll is?
Okay, but I have to say those are brilliant suggestions.
They are very
just brilliant. And just on the linguistic part, let me just say, we've done the European Union face-to-face deliberative polling twice. bringing everybody to Brussels in 22 languages at the same time, and it worked great. We've also done purely online deliberative polls, sometimes with video and discussions, not just asynchronous. And so these things can be adopted. The basic concept's very simple, but it could be adopted to some of these. The basic idea is just you prepare with an advisory group policy options and pros and cons of different alternative choices, and then you develop a questionnaire, and then you collect those opinions from a random representative sample, stratified according to whatever criteria you say, from whatever the given population is. Then you're asking the question, not what do people think, what do people think under good conditions for thinking about it? If they really had an extended chance to engage the issues, to hear from their fellow members of that population, I was going to say fellow citizens, maybe fellow netizens, hear and discuss from different points of view in depth for a day or two, for an extended period of time, as well as dialogue with competing experts, getting responses from different points of view. And then at the end of that, and I'm not talking about people sitting in a room the way we were sitting this morning. I'm talking about you're only sitting in the room if the questions from the groups are being answered, questions you've worked quite a bit on, but mostly in small group discussions. Then at the end, you take another survey, and confidentially, so we don't have the group pressure. A lot of the distortions in juries come from the pressure to reach a verdict, you know, and all the things that go wrong with juries come from the social pressure. Well, we have the individual opinions. We just collect and aggregate the opinions, and we can then explain quantitatively and qualitatively how and why the opinions change. So that's all a deliberative poll is. It's a really simple idea.
And let me just ask, have we been joined now by Ritu Srivastava? Is she here? You're Ritu. Okay, you had your hand up. I also wanted to get to Chris Riley, but since you had your hand up, we'll give you the microphone next. And then we'll come to Chris. And Naran Jargal, are you here? Okay. So we'll go to Ritu, and then Chris, and then Naran Jargal, and then we'll open it up again. And
This person has been waiting a long time, too. Did you have a
who is that? Is it something quick? I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Rafik Damak. I'm just here in my individual capacity. So I'm trying to understand this idea and to see how it can be used in going policy-making process. So, for example, if I take what's happening in ICANN with two critical process about the IANA stewardship transition and ICANN accountability, and usually we have working groups. They are supposed to include all stakeholders and working for a month. So how you can plug this kind of component in such process, at which level? Because if I try to, you said it's a questionnaire before, questionnaire after, and there is a kind of input. It sounds for me like, looks like kind of open consultation. So what's the difference here in this process? How you are trying to make people to select between alternatives? So we have something existing, how we can add this a new component, and how you see it can fit here.
You need an issue that's ripe for to consult a larger population that you can sample. And so that might be an earlier stage discussion of different directions for what should happen with the governance of ICANN, for example. If you have a working group, and the working group is able to identify 2 or 3 or 4 key options that involve trade-offs that are difficult, and they've reached the point where it's not obvious which of those options ought to be adopted, and it would be useful to vet the problem with the broader internet community. Then if you vetted it in this process with a broader community, you could get a lot of interesting reactions about the reasons for and against each of those options, and you might even reframe the whole issue And that could then be useful input to the working group, just hypothetically. So you need, the issues have a certain level of, they have to be ripe for decision, but there has to be, a variety of alternatives. And really, when I say trade-offs, I really mean it. Some hard choices where there really are people who want this and who want that, and some people want that, and sometimes they don't even articulate their reasons, and in the normal process, that might just all be papered over with some bland statement. No, if you really want to get at it, then you can vet a variety of possible solutions, competing solutions, as you said, and then hopefully that will be useful.
Okay. Did you want?
Oh, well, I would just adding a few dimensions that don't necessarily lead to impact on policy, but that do make it different from other working groups, one of which is you don't necessarily end up with a consensus, but you do end up with information about what changed people's opinions, what moved the conversation, and you also have the dimension of confidentiality, which is an aspect of it that I personally don't even have my hands around yet in this community where we all talk about the need for transparency and at every setting in everything we do. And I'm really kind of curious about how that's going to shake out. It's much more like going in a voting booth and pulling the lever. And in this case, you'll do it before, this is where it goes to the Nedison issue, whether government reps or other company reps or others can take that hat off and say, what do I really think? And pull the lever behind, confidentially, then engage in a conversation that will also be confidential, which is very different from the way a lot of us work in a lot of these settings. And that's different from those working groups. And then again, when you so-called vote at the end, it's confidential. And yet the people behind the scenes will have the indication of how those things have affected your vote. And so I'm not quite sure how it's going to shake out, but those are some differences.
Okay, Ritu, maybe you can introduce yourself, and thank you for your patience.
Hi, I'm Ritu and I'm working with Digital Empowerment Foundation, which is based in a Delhi-based organization, India-based organizations. And let me just introduce you about Digital Empowerment Foundation, what we are doing it. We are trying to provide the access and the last mile connectivity in India and across the country. We have presence of 150 centers across the country. When I talk about India, there is a 243 million internet users. However, when I say it, that means 90% of them are not even online. And when I'm talking about 90%, most of them are rural. They are first time, they are just exploring the internet. You guys are talking about multi-stakeholder mechanism. How many people are representing specifically in such internet governance forums or mechanism? Large number of population is not being represented by them. A few number of CSO organizations or a few people are representing 1.2 billion people. Is it the right number to calculate them, or what you would like to suggest that? Personally, on a belief term, that I really welcome the idea of this vector mechanism and everything, but I have 3 questions on the right side. There are 3.3 million NGO civil society groups in India. There are I'm not sure about others. How would you like to engage other civil society groups in this engagement process? And those CSOs are not even working with the grassroots sectors. They are really trying, they don't even understand this complex words and terminologies, what you talk about net neutrality, not even government understands it. They are still exploring it. They are just trying to make their faces, yes, we do understand, but are they really understand it? That's the question. So how would you face those issues? Second question is on the term of, most of issues are related to the directly human right issues, such as online harassment against women, child protection issues, other issues are also there in the internet governance forums. How would you deal with, strengthen these mechanisms in other international or other forums which are directly dealing with human right mechanism? How would you make a bridge or gap on that? And the third question is on the side of when government, you talk about the government, really, as I think Rebecca talked about regional IGFs. There are a number of governments which are not even engaged with the regional IGF. They are just been talking about it. How would you deal with those government? And how would you try to implicate such policy interventions with those governments? Thank you.
Those are really good questions. So do you want to respond to any of them, or do you want to, Eileen?
Eileen should
Why don't you
start.
start?
I have two to the first two, because it goes to this issue of replicability. On your point about dealing with people who may not be familiar with the substance, this goes to Simone's point about, you need to get a PhD practically before you can start having any of these conversations, and everybody working in this space knows how complex it is, and it's constantly moving. So, and yet, and I think that Larry and Jim, work in the field of democracy. If you believe in democratic process, you basically believe in the ability of people to make good decisions if informed well. And that's what they're banking on. So if the materials are prepared well, that's the theory that let the people pose the question and use that as a decision-making tool. But to your bigger question, how are you going to engage other members of civil society? You said 3.3 million different civil society organizations in India alone. Most of those don't show up at the IGF. That's, again, at the top we said one of the most attractive dimensions of this. This is a one-off experiment where lessons will be learned. It is replicable. It could be done simply in lots of different regions of India, just among civil society organizations. Those are legitimate experiments. It doesn't always have to be multi-stakeholder. It could be different communities, and it could be in different kinds of government-only fora or regional groups where it's mostly governments. I mean, it could, you've done this in lots of different settings with different types of players, but one of the ideas here about capacity building for internet governance is that whole new communities, new stakeholders can be brought into the process, and they don't have to necessarily be fully up to speed before their input is considered important.
Very much in the spirit of what she said. Obviously, as I said, the premise of this particular first pilot was that the IGF community was a relevant community for internet governance. But we have done deliberative polling on very complicated issues where the idea is to boil them down to the basic trade-offs and the competing values. I mean, we did the first deliberative poll in Japan was on doshusei, which is, I think, the most complicated policy proposal known to the history of man about the reforming the whole structure of the Japanese government. And it worked great, but it took a tremendous amount of work by my Japanese colleagues to boil down such a complicated thing. I still can't quite wrap my mind around the whole issue. I think that with work, it could be done. But I think the kinds of communities you're talking about are communities that we're dealing with in a number of other countries on other issues. I mentioned before you came, I think, the project we just did in Tanzania and in Uganda and in Ghana. And with enough work, you can get the trade-offs down and consult relevant populations about choices that affect them. And I have strongly resisted the idea that you have to be highly educated to deliberate. You have to or that it's only the most developed countries that can deliberate. People everywhere are smart if you do all the hard work to prepare the agenda so that it's understandable and accessible to them. So if we're lucky, we will be able to deal with the agenda of issues you just laid out, but it may not be the first one.
Okay, we don't have a huge amount of time left, so I want to call on Chris Riley finally, and then Ranjar go.
Okay, so I don't know if I'm going to sum up per se, but I do think I can take some of this to a higher level of abstraction, which I hope will help. So the first thing I want to say is I think this is an interesting set of problems to study, right? We're trying to tackle how to take community through a process that balances inclusion, open discussion, and decisiveness on issues that are really controversial. Like, let's take a step back and recognize that's a really freaking hard problem. Where consensus is possible, great. So there's a starting point of like, if we can get to consensus, then we don't need this. So I think of this kind of mechanism as applicable to situations where consensus just isn't possible. Meaningful, difficult problems that we need to get to some sort of path forward on, and we need to have a mechanism that gets us to an output that feels legitimate. So the starting point in my head is the outcome is never really going to be substantively accepted by everybody. So they need to have a degree of trust in the process that it was meaningfully inclusive to get to the outcome that it did to. How do you get to a feeling of legitimacy? I'm making this up. I'm gonna throw two things out there. I don't know that these are the right two things. I'd say a critical mass of people need to believe that they had an opportunity to affect the outcome. That's a different way of reframing the inclusiveness point. And then there needs to be a healthy degree of trust in anybody who's more empowered than the average person in the process. So I think that's part of why I'm really interested in this, right? Sampling gives you the theoretical opportunity to be one of the people who effectively gets a vote while reducing the number. And the process owner is an academic who's not a stakeholder and whose greatest set of incentives are maintaining the integrity of the process and not skewing it in some way. So that, I think, is what makes me really interested to see how this is. Like, I think others, I'm not convinced this is a magic solution to many things in the space. It's not intended to be, I know, but I do think it's interesting, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how it goes. A couple more brief things. Choosing among paths forward, Simone put this up, I feel like is a good procedural start. You get experts involved in laying the terrain, setting out a set of options, translating technical issues through analysis into a set of sort of more fundamental normative choices that are then suitable for this kind of survey instrument. I'd like to suggest you consider adding to that some sort of after the fact mechanism where people who were in the survey are empowered to complain that the set of options presented to them was not sufficient. Then you might need to do like another random sampling if you're going to try to find an objective way to determine that, but that can be worked out later. The second point is think and talk a lot, both think and talk a lot about how the sampling works. It's really easy to mess it up, either inadvertently or to skew it to get some sort of desired output. And for me, as I said before, like the key to legitimacy is to make everybody feel like they have a fair opportunity. I'm a little curious, we can talk about this later, why you're sampling at all. Like I do believe that you need to, because a survey of everybody would not necessarily be accurate. There's a tyranny of a majority problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But why 300 instead of 3,000, for example, in the context of the IGF? Like that's something that I don't need you to answer it today. I want you to talk about it a lot, because people need to feel like your sampling process was fair and was accurate.
Can I just say?
That's all I had. So
Yeah, first of all, that's a brilliant overview of you captured exactly what we're trying to do. You captured it really well. Now, but just on that last point, I mentioned it really fast, but what I think we're going to do is we're going to try to survey everybody, and then we're going to invite to the deliberative process a subset who are, so everybody gets it, and then we're going to actually get everybody at the end also to do a survey, and that makes it a controlled experiment because we have a random subsample that's the treatment group and everybody else is a kind of control group. So we'll see what is the effect of going through the IGF process in its normal form, and what is the effect of going through this in addition to the IGF process. Now, I think that but I think we can easily also add some open-ended questions at the end, both for the treatment and the control group, about were these the right questions. So we'll be able to collect that.
I think that's great. Then just make sure that you're talking a lot to the people about how you get to the random sample for the deliberative group, because
Yeah.
incredible transparency and honesty.
Yeah, very good.
These are really excellent ideas and
And I just want to say, the only reason we're not going to do, and Eileen is the only one who thought, maybe we should be more ambitious and do this for the whole IGF. And I said, just the logistics of having 300 people really deliberate in small groups, 300 is enough statistically, and it's a big challenge. So we're not going to do it for 3,000.
I am really interested to see how 300 can work. That sounds like about 10 times too many.
Okay, Naranjargal.
Okay, thank you. I represent a Mongolian NGO called Global International Center. We are a media NGO. We are mainly specialized in freedom of expression and freedom of information. So we also have been working in the provinces, in the very lowest administrative units, since 2005. So I'm just wonder, I have just asked two questions about it. One is, you know, that I more wondering if, about representation, especially in Mongolia, because we have a so high contrast between the urban citizens and the rural citizens, especially when it comes to the herders who are still nomadic, and they are not really like the computer literacy and so on. So, but if you really can't engage those people, of course, there will be no trust, you know. Because the second question is trust building, because in Mongolia, you know, mainly the people do not really trust such kind of online and the service and so on. Recently, you know that the Mongolian government actually, they did the polling, SMS polling. So my organization was asked to conduct a monitoring on this, but we said, sorry, we can't, because we really don't have a capacity on that. We even do not have any idea how to monitor it, because this also quite the time to get understand the process and to conduct the monitoring, have to, and so on. The second one is, you know, that of course we are still a society that top-down management exists. So the public officials are accepted as their bosses still in the countryside, though. So the people, the community, especially the local communities, still feel very weak themselves, and many of them still think that they can't really be engaged to the decision-making process because they also don't trust it. So how we can balance this, the kind of public awareness thing as education, this construct, something like this, because I'm sure that if you start this process, of course, it would be working in the urban, especially that we can engage the youth, because the most of users are young people of internet and the mobile phone users are young people. But maybe we should have to say, start this process from the bottom in Mongolia, because some people have an idea, some others don't have it. So how we can really balance it, it could be. And the other thing is the civil society is not really aware about these technologies and internet governance issues and the other, the freedom and the issues and so on, is still very weak. Because and that's why we, in order to have this kind of equal access and equal engagement, of course, all stakeholders should have at least the same level of understanding and law knowledge, something like this. Thank you.
Okay. We really have to close very shortly, but do you have any?
We have one comment.
Oh, sorry.
There.
Go ahead, and it's just, I'm aware it's 2:15, and unfortunately we started late, so it's just the burden we carry. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may just add a quick comment following the discussions. The question of representativity is the biggest trap when we're talking about multi-stakeholder processes. As long as people have in mind, when we say representative, the kind of representative democracy type of thing, the thing is doomed. So there needs to be a strong explanation. The way I usually explain it is that this is not about representing people, but representing the diversity of viewpoints. So there might be one person who is absolutely not in the category. It can be a white male from the north that will actually know about a topic that concerns women in a rural environment in Africa for whatever reason, for a moment. The question of representation needs to be documented to avoid being criticized because the composition of the sample would be the all and beginning and all.
Yeah.
The important point I want to make is when we talk about deliberative polling, as far as I understand, there's an importance of stressing deliberative rather than polling. What people get and hear is we make a poll at the beginning and we make a poll at the end. What I find interesting in this is the precise way in which discussion changes the perception.
Oh, we do.
There is an expression, no, I know you agree, but I want to highlight it because when people hear deliberative polling, they don't hear deliberative because they don't know how it works. The analogy is usually the experience of citizen juries. You know, the system whereby you pick people completely at random, and the goal is to expose them to experts that present the different facets. And the problem we have in the IGF and all those processes is that we try to put the experts on panels instead of having basically the participants being exposed, but being the ones who actually make the decision among themselves and discuss among themselves. And what you need to document is how iterative the process is. What you're going to try at the IGF, I guess, is the very early stage of issue framing. And the biggest danger of those things is to put people in the position of having to choose A or B, or pro or against. If I take the example of net neutrality, the first step is to understand that there are at least 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions in there. And if this process can produce on certain topics an outcome that is a clear 1-pager or 2-pager document where the different dimensions of an issue are clearly laid out by a group, and people afterwards who have not participated in the sample say, well, okay, that makes it clearer for me, then you get a success.
Can I just say, I agree with what you've said. The citizen juries are too small. They're 12 or 18 people. So statistically, they can't represent anything. And then because they operate like a jury, they have to reach a consensus. And what we've found, and others have found, is that the distortions come from the social pressure to reach a consensus. So we want to be able to study the sincere opinions at the individual level. That's why we take the confidential questionnaire. So I think this will work better than the juries. But we have to emphasize the deliberation and, yes, the criteria for selection and representativeness. All of that will have to be laid out very carefully.
Okay, I am actually delighted to have been advised by Laka, is that correct? Sorry? Oh, Leah, that we have until 2:30, is that correct? Yeah, and she is connected to the authority behind this conference. Okay. We thank you for that. It's actually very helpful because it means we can now invite participation from some of the others present here. So does anyone else have an opinion, a comment, a question, anything? And please, if you would introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I joined late, so I might have missed some part of the presentation. My name is Stefania Milan, University of Amsterdam, but also very involved with ICANN and the civil society with ICANN, and that's based on that that I want to make this comment. One of my concerns when we try to recruit people to participate is the sustainability over time on the engagement. So not just getting their opinion once, right, because this is not really what I would call capacity building. So I would like to know how your mechanism is supposed to fit, if it is, into this kind of longer-term capacity building and sustainability of the engagement. Another reason why I say this is that what we observe within the civil society engaged in this type of mechanisms and participatory governance is that we are always the same faces around the table. We move across different countries, different events, but it's always us. And part of that is because you need expertise, you need time, and so on and so forth. But then, how can we move from use your mechanism, which from the academic point of view I find very interesting, by the way, to make sure that we break this individualistic approach to the topic and try to also build, engagement that goes through a collective process. I hope this is clear, sorry. I'm thinking as I speak.
Well, the sustainability would be in the capacity building to do this again. But if we take a random sample of the IGF, and then the next year we take another random sample of the IGF, many of the people will be different. We don't want the same people because we want a fresh sample in order to be representative of that year's IGF or that year's some other population that's relevant to the internet. Now, we found when people deliberate, it actually affects them and they become more engaged. Of course, these people are, this population, as I said, the premise of this is that the IGF population is a relevant population. But we find with ordinary people, when we bring them to deliberate, it's a big experience for them and they become more engaged in public issues, they become much more informed, they continue to become much more informed and engaged a year later or 2 years later. And so in that sense, it is sustainable in terms of creating netizens. But in terms of a capacity to actually assess what that community would think if it were really thinking, you want a fresh sample each time. And that will actually spread the experience over time.
Okay, please.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for coming in again. So I would like to offer a comment and 2 suggestions. And my comment is going back to the, and thank you for the clarification on the linkage between how you see that as potentially being replicated in other processes. I think that's super relevant. I do think that it would be worth doing a feasibility of applying or replicating this model at a global level. And I don't know if that's something that's been done, because all the examples that you mentioned are national, as far as I understand. So it would be really interesting.
Or European Union-wide.
Right. Okay. So thinking about UN processes where a lot of internet policy, with what Rebecca said, with smaller IG, with smaller and non-capitalized, are at the level of global decision making, where democratic deficit is so high that reforming it poses really considerable questions. I think that's where this is interesting. If internet governance can be a mechanism whereby we bring in this type of thinking into those spaces, would be incredibly valuable. So I really like this idea, but I'm curious, or I would like to see ways in which that could work. And why I'm saying this is, having been participating in a number of processes to do with internet governance over the past couple of years, for instance, in Cannes cooperation, which has been discussed extensively, the issues are not actually factual, and the issues are political. So the value of this sort of kind of a procedural tool to help decision making, I don't know how much it can do in this space. So, yeah.
Just maybe for amusement, I should say that with one of my Stanford colleagues, who's a methodologist, we actually developed a scheme for how to recruit, I don't know if I should say it, a global sample of internet users, a good representative sample of the world's internet users. And imagine such a deliberation, what that would be like. It boggles the mind. It makes even the European Union seem like a simple thing.
I have to throw in, then you want to get really ambitious, you do a global sample of the non-internet users and include them in the process. I mean, that ultimately is one of the big issues, is the 4 billion who aren't connected, are affected. So we can get really ambitious.
Having, yeah, just back from Tanzania, I can say that I can appreciate the
That's-
challenges.
So, and just quickly, just maybe two practical, just suggestions I think will be
Please.
useful. One is just think about how you communicate this. I think it's really complicated at the moment. So just a PR thing, like what is the problem statement and what is this actually is. I think it can be refined a little bit. And the second one is thinking about a practical link with the IGF. And I don't know if you already have that, but there are ways that you could actually, that this could be useful for the IGF and in which the existing process that the IGF and innovations that IGF is bringing to the table can be linked to this. So maybe through the advisory board, linking through the MAG. So that's it. Thank you.
The IGF has been very helpful so far. They've really been gone the extra mile in this, in helping us in the planning and the logistics and everything else.
So I think that we have reached the time when we need to allow people to go to their next sessions and allow the session coming in here to come in. But thank you for the extra time. Thank you all for coming. Please communicate with us if you have any other suggestions or ideas. But I will tell you, this has just been an enormously valuable and stimulating session. So thank you all.